Army trucks are built to run in the harshest conditions where other trucks their size wouldn't dare go. They are very reliable, which is why old military vehicles are still being used today, long after they have gone out of service of the military. However, many people take their reliability for granted and neglect to do important maintenance. This causes the truck to break down, usually at the worst possible time, and is usually much more expensive than if you had done the maintenance at first. So whether you've owned your truck for years or just bought it in an auction, here are 10 maintenance tasks that I highly recommend to keep your truck running in top condition. So number one is to grease the zerk fittings. So one thing that makes Army trucks and older trucks in general more reliable than modern vehicles is that you can add grease to surfaces that move a lot via these zerk fittings. These trucks have zerk fittings all over the place, but they are commonly found on things like bushings, universal joints, steering racks, knuckles, and on the pintle hitch on the back. These components wear more quickly if you do not grease them. In modern components, they are sealed with the grease already inside so that they can be left maintenance-free for longer periods of time. But on the Army trucks, the idea is that you can continually refill the grease so that these parts stay well lubricated and last significantly longer. Number two, I would recommend to change and or clean your air filter. If your truck has a paper air filter, you need to change it periodically to keep air flowing. However, if you have an older truck, it may have an oil bath air filter. This filter uses a type of cloth to filter the air, and the cloth is cleaned by this oil bath at the bottom. Oil is sucked up into the cloth, and the dirt gets trapped in the oil, and then the oil goes back down, drips back down into the pan. As you can imagine, the oil gets very dirty and should be changed with every oil change. And especially if you're operating in any kind of dusty conditions, you should change the oil in the air filter more often. And just a tip from someone who has been there before, make sure that there is actually a cloth filter unit inside the air filter housing before putting oil in there. Engines need oil in order to lubricate, and that oil needs to be changed periodically. Most people who work on cars know this, but that doesn't mean that they always follow it. Although modern oils say that they can last longer than conventional oil, I would still err on the side of caution, especially with vehicles that are older and more worn out. And replace the oil every couple of years or 3,000 miles, whichever comes first. Also, make sure you change your oil if you've been in sand, mud, or water. Gear oil changes don't need to happen as often, but they are still important for ensuring that the gears in the transmission, transfer case, and axles are well lubricated and don't wear out. I would say every 5 years or 10,000 miles. And again, you should probably change the gear oil if you operate in sandy, dusty, muddy, or wet conditions. As I explained in this video, there are two types of brake fluid: hydroscopic and hydrophobic brake fluid. DOT3 brake fluid needs to be changed periodically regardless of miles. That is because the water from the atmosphere is absorbed into the brake fluid. And as more water is absorbed, it the brake fluid loses its effectiveness. This can lead to brake failure when you are using your brakes the most. On the other hand, .5 fluid does not mix with water. So the water that enters the system will settle into the bottom near the wheel cylinders. This requires you to periodically drain the bleeder valves at the wheel cylinders so that all the water is removed. Otherwise, your wheel cylinders and bleeder valves and basically all the lower components of your brake system will rust out. And if you try to use your brakes too much, well, there's a bunch of water in the bottom. That water can evaporate and then your brake system won't work. However, with .5 brake fluid, you don't have to completely change the fluid because the fluid doesn't lose its effectiveness due to that water. You just have to drain out the little bit of water that has accumulated and then top off the brake fluid. Now, one important thing to remember is you do not want to mix the two different types of brake fluid. If you are going to change over from one to the other, I changed from a .5 fluid in my 1952 GMC M211 to a .3 brake fluid. If you are going to change over, make sure you drain all your old brake fluid out and then fill up the system with the new brake fluid. You don't want any of that fluid to mix. For number 6, it's cleaning, painting, and rust proofing, all combined. If you leave your truck muddy or if the paint flakes off, you're just inviting rust. Rust will ruin your truck and it really creeps up on you, so you need to make sure you stay on top of it. Make sure you spray down your truck after driving in mud, sand, or snow. Make sure you keep all metal surfaces sprayed with paint or some other material that can ensure no corrosion can form. And also, if you're driving in the winter a lot up in the north, get your vehicle oil undercoated. This oil undercoating coats all the surfaces of your undercarriage and even inside of the body panels with a layer of oil that can help make sure that no moisture gets in. Number 7 is tires. Now, tires connect your car to the road, so it's very important that you have the best tires. Make sure your tires have plenty of tread, make sure they are free from defects, make sure they are inflated to the proper temperature. Now, I'm planning a video all about tires, so let me know if that's something you want to see, and I will do my best to try to get it done. Number 8 is axle seals. This is the rear axle of a pickup truck. Now, in the center is the differential. There's gears in here that transfer the rotational motion of the drive shaft into rotation of the axle shafts, which go out and turn the wheels. The axle shafts out near the wheels run on bearings that make sure that there is no friction between the axle shaft and the axle housing. So the differential requires gear oil in order to run effectively, and these bearings require axle grease in order to run effectively. Axle seals are very important to separate these two compartments where the gear oil is and the axle grease, because the grease can actually dissolve into the oil if the two are mixed. That will get rid of the grease that is helping these bearings function, and then the bearings will lock up, they'll go bad, and also dissolving more grease into the gear oil will just make the gear oil thicker and it won't function as well as a lubricant. Axle seals don't need to be redone very often. Usually you can just replace them when you're doing something else, such as installing a new differential or maybe a locker. However, I would put axle seals on the maintenance list for any Army truck you just bought, because who knows when the last time they were done. And if there is a problem with the seals, all the grease or the gear oil could leak out, and then the bearings could seize, and your bearings are a little bad, your axle shafts, your differential. It's a good way to prevent problems with the other more expensive components. Now, speaking of bearings, if you're changing out your axle seals, you should think about changing your bearings. If your bearings are good, then maybe you don't have to, but if this is an old truck, maybe the bearings haven't been greased as often as they should have, and so if they're showing any signs of wear, I would just recommend getting new ones, especially if you just bought this vehicle, and as long as you're already taking apart the axles to replace the seals anyway, you may as well do the bearings at the same time. And number 10 is brake shoes. If you haven't already realized, brakes are kind of important. So make sure you keep an eye on your brake shoes, make sure they are adjusted properly, and make sure you change them when you need to. Army brake shoes, the brake shoes for these large trucks, they don't have the same wear indicators that passenger cars have. So you won't hear that grinding noise that generally warns you, hey, you need to replace your brake pads soon. So you need to be more cognizant of your brake shoes. And remember, as your shoes wear down, they also need to be adjusted. If you feel like your truck is having trouble stopping, I would recommend checking the brake shoes. Okay, and then here are a couple bonuses. These are things that can be done when you are doing these other things and don't require a lot of extra effort, but might help you in the long run. So wheel cylinders. If you're changing the brake pads, you should think about changing the wheel cylinders. Wheel cylinders tend to develop problems with rust. They also have springs and they have rubber diaphragms inside of them, and so those things can start to wear out over time. So if you've never changed your wheel cylinders in your Army truck and you have no idea when the last time they were done, and you're going to be changing the brake pads anyway, I would recommend changing all your wheel cylinders as well. And the good part about it is you can get new wheel cylinders, but you can also get wheel cylinder rebuild kits. So once you replace the wheel cylinders, you can rebuild the 6 wheel cylinders with the rebuild kits, and then you can have them on the shelf for the next time you have this issue. However, once you do have new wheel cylinders, they do tend to last a long time. Another thing is throttle cables and throttle springs. Springs wear out over time, and your throttle return spring is responsible for closing the throttle after you let off the gas. You can avoid a stuck throttle if you replace the throttle return spring when it's starting to get old, and also think about the condition of your throttle and choke cables. Taking care to inspect these components thoroughly when you have the time to fix things can avoid sudden problems that can be quite dangerous. Also, fuel injectors. I'm usually an if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of guy. However, if I know the weak points of a system and I'm working on that system anyway, I usually like to address those weak points so that they don't become problems later on. If you have a diesel truck that's been sitting for many years, and if you're going to be doing engine work anyway, it's a good idea to replace the injectors, because the injectors tend to get plugged up, especially if they've been sitting for a long time, or if they've had fuel pass through them that isn't the best. Maybe it has some water in it, maybe it has some other debris and stuff. So this will, changing your injectors or having them cleaned and put back in, will help you avoid headaches later on. And lastly is fuel pumps. Old military trucks usually have mechanical fuel pumps. These rely on springs and rubber diaphragms in order to pump fuel. And as you can recall, these things tend to go bad over time. So if you're going through and doing a bunch of engine work, you might want to rebuild that fuel pump while you're at it. Otherwise, you might go to start the truck and find that there's fuel coming out of the vent on the fuel pump.